Ian's attack caused a lightning spark effect around. Andolph was like being burned and immediately lost consciousness when it was hit by the attack. Ian then landed smoothly in front of it after sending the attack, but his attack did not stop there. He then cast a wind sword blade and attacked Andolph right in its stomach using it. Ian then added a vacuum explosion to the wind sword blade which then exploded Andolph's stomach and made it spit out a mouthful of blood. Andolph then could only let himself lie limp on the ground after being hit by his relentless attack. Ian also looked breathless after throwing all these attacks. After whimpering for a while, Andolph then lost consciousness. Seeing the corpses of the wolves lying lifeless around him, Ian sighed with relief because it was finally over too, but he was then surprised when suddenly there was movement from Andolph who he thought was dead. Ian was surprised because Andolph could still live despite all his attacks. He was also worried because his mana was now also running out, but he then realized something when he saw Andolph's form suddenly change to resemble a human at the end of his life. Andolph then thanked him for freeing him from his curse. Ian then sighed with relief at that. It almost surprised him. He also said to him if he wanted to thank him, give him a clue about his curse and an item, don't just say thank you. Hearing that, Andolph then said, "Oh dear." Ian was then confused to hear that and asked what it meant, but unfortunately Andolph then met his death without having time to explain it further. Ian was silent seeing that, then could only swear. Just like Ian, Mave and Philip had also finished their fight and killed all the wolves that invaded. They had also made a fireplace again for them to warm themselves. Mave then suddenly saw Ian who walked towards them from the forest while carrying Andolph's head. Philip was then horrified when he saw him carrying a severed head. He guessed the origin of the head. Ian confirmed his guess. This was a werewolf. This person who led the wolf pack that ambushed them. Mave was then shocked to hear that. He really managed to get his head alone. It also raised a hope in her. Maybe Ian could really find the dark mage, but Mave then asked, why did he go there alone? He could have died. Had he forgotten the promise they made? Hearing that, Ian only replied that the werewolf could have escaped if he waited for her. Hearing his answer, Mave then asked why he could be so sure. It was just his assumption. Hearing her doubts, Ian then told her to look at the wolves that had fallen around here. They could easily be handled by her and Philip. She might even be able to handle them all alone. But instead of trying to kill them, the wolves were just trying to make them tired, and the werewolf was hiding in the back watching. He told her why he was doing that. Because the werewolf was not as strong as she thought. He wanted to fight him because he saw he was alone. If he was not alone, he was sure the werewolf would have run away. Mave then could only be silent hearing his answer. He understood he was worried. He also valued his own life. He was not good or noble enough to sacrifice his life for others. He was not a knight like her. He was just a mercenary. Mave was speechless when she heard that. She couldn't think of a reply to his words. She then said that she understood, but from now on, she wanted him to tell her his plan before he moved. Don't try to do everything alone. Ian could only accept that. He then invited them to leave. This place was full of corpses. They agreed to that. Ian then told Philip to bring his horse. Philip understood. Ian thought that everything should be done. He also got something. He got 1 health point as a reward after completing the Andolph hunting mission. He also thought about putting all his stat points into intelligence and mental power because this character was really messed up, but he was then surprised because in addition to getting 1 health point, he also got a curse essence. He then saw it lying next to Andolph's corpse. He was surprised because Andolph also had an essence. He didn't see it in the game. Curse essence can be used immediately, but after use, the user will be entangled by the curse of madness. Ian also felt the effect was too crazy, so he decided to keep it first. He thought maybe he could use this later, in the midst of his struggle of thoughts. Philip then said that he had brought his horse, but Philip was then surprised when the horse suddenly did not want to obey. The horse then stood up in fear when he saw Ian, who gave off a very scary aura. It made the horse so scared that it made its mouth foam. The horse then fell to the ground unconscious. Philip was then very confused to see that. He even asked if the horse had died. He was very confused about what actually happened. Ian also asked if it was because his body was covered in blood. Philip then knelt down to apologize. He thought he had taken care of it carefully. Mave then told him to be more careful. She also apologized to Ian about it, and said she would replace it. But Ian immediately said that it was not necessary. After all, he didn't mean it, but he was a little tired now. Ian seemed to be thinking of a bad idea at the moment. Hearing that, Philip then could only smile imposingly. At a stream in the forest where they were, after walking for some time, they finally got there. Philip then gasped with exhaustion after walking for so long, because his horse fainted. Ian now rode Philip's horse instead, which made him only able to walk. After riding the horse, Ian felt that Philip's horse was much better than his horse. Seeing him exhausted, Ian then called him and gave him the gift that the maid gave him. Philip was then very happy to receive it. Ian said he could take half of it, then told him to prepare well. Philip understood. Ian also told him to wash his hands first, then clean his armor. After finishing cooking, Philip happily accepted his orders. Philip then went straight to the stream to wash his hands. Ian did not expect that he could be handled so easily. Seeing him with his back to her, Mave then asked what he was doing. Ian replied, as he saw, he took off his armor. He wanted to clean himself. His whole body was sticky from being covered in blood. Mave finally realized it after hearing that. Ian was then surprised and asked what she was doing. When he saw her about to take off her armor, Mave replied that she was also going to clean herself. She also invited him to do it together. Ian was then stunned to hear that, and the two of them ended up bathing together in the river. Ian was surprised by that. He even asked if things like this were normal in this world. He initially thought he was used to this world. Their relationship was also not that far away. Mave then suddenly called him. Ian was then confused by that. Mave asked if he was injured, although he was confused why she was just asking that now. But Ian still replied that he was fine. Mave was then amazed to hear that. He fought against the werewolf and returned without any injuries. When watching him fight, Mave felt that his fighting style was a little different. She even felt that Ian was more trained than knights like her. Seeing the way he treated Philip and the knowledge he had, she was sure that he was not an ordinary mercenary. She even thought that Ian was a nobleman disguised as a commoner, because such cases are not uncommon. Ian was really dumbfounded to hear that. He was confused about what she was thinking. He then replied that he was just someone from the streets. But Mave did not believe that. She felt that Ian must have his own reasons why he did that, just like her. She chose to become an apostle of the tyrant and the precious sword of this kingdom, rather than living as a great lady of the Laurel family. Hearing that, Ian pondered for a moment. Apostle, when someone is blessed by a god, that person will become an apostle and be granted some of the god's power. That sounds very powerful. But there is usually a limit or a price to pay to maintain that power. Ian then suddenly asked what kind of god the tyrant was. Mave was then surprised when he really asked such a thing. Ian only replied that he was not close to the gods. There were too many gods in Aquilonia, so it was hard to know them all. Mave then replied that she was hard to serve with a relaxed mind. Tyran was the goddess of condemnation, the shiny Rue Solar's second daughter and the sword that condemns the guilty. Hearing that, Ian pondered for a moment. Condemnation, if that was the name she declared, he felt that her other name must be even crazier. The main motive of Aquilonia was betrayal and corruption. Because of that, all the gods had other names and their famous names, and that could be their weakness. Just like the other name of the god of light, Rue Solar, is faith. Hearing him talk about the other name of Tyran, Mave then said of course there is one, it is revenge. Ian was then surprised to hear that. Exacting revenge by severing sins is ultimately a substitute for someone's vengeance. Sometimes, it becomes the target of revenge itself. Condemnation different name is revenge. Therefore, legitimate revenge will be blessed by Tyran. Ian finally realized it. He also wondered if this was the secret of the Bleeding Avenger. He was sure Mave didn't get corrupt for no reason. She became an apostle of vengeance from the condemnation. She just told him about the limitations of being an apostle of Tyran. She said that she couldn't lie or ignore the guilt. If she lost her favor, she lost her blessing too. You would lose your blessing if you acted against the god's name. Knowing her limitations allowed her to adapt. But the question was, why did she become an avenger? Was it because vengeance of a fallen family? Or hatred for someone? If so, if he could stop her from becoming a bleeding avenger. But Ian then immediately rejected the idea, because she had to become a bleeding avenger. That way, the boss of the first part, he currently still didn't have enough information, so he decided to wait. Mave then asked him, you don't seem to have served any god. Ian confirmed that, and said he would still do so. Mave felt he must have a reason for that too, but she believed, the god watching over him right now, at this time, might have wanted him, who knows. Hearing that, Ian then sent a middle finger towards the sky. He was now getting hungry. He then invited Mave to go eat. After seeing the werewolf's head hanging, Philip was then amazed at him. He was amazed that he could take care of a monster like a werewolf alone. Just thinking about it gave him goosebumps. He felt Ian was very amazing, but Ian was a little annoyed to see him so chatty. He kept talking non-stop since last night. Ian then just said that it was nothing, monsters like that were everywhere. Hearing that, Philip was then confused because they didn't see many monsters during the trip. Ian was then surprised to hear that. He asked if he really didn't see it. He had seen hundreds of monsters since getting out of the swamp and into the Agellan kingdom. Mave confirmed that they only saw a few goblins and kobolds along the path. Hearing her mention about the path, Ian then realized something. The city where he arrived after getting out of the swamp was the bulk city of the Agellan kingdom. He started acting as a mercenary from there too. He solved the problems in that city as a mercenary, and traveled using the path that connects the kingdom, the Imperial Road. He had killed many monsters along the way. Ian then could only sigh helplessly. He finally realized that he had cleared the path for them. Philip was then confused hearing that. Ian then explained it. It meant that their good days were over. This kingdom was more chaotic than they thought. After walking for a while, they then arrived at the top of a cliff and saw a village that looked destroyed. Ian never expected it to be this chaotic so soon. Philip also felt sorry when he saw it. He then asked if he thought this was the work of the rogue. This was not a countryside, but a place near the Imperial Road. But he was then surprised when he saw Mave, who looked very angry. Mave felt that this was really unforgivable, stepping on the lives of citizens in this way. Ian could only sigh at that, getting annoyed at everything. What a virtuous knight. Maybe that was also why she couldn't find the dark mage. She might have wasted time because of things like this. He hoped there was at least a quest. After observing for a while, Ian then saw a group of people not far from the village. Ian smiled slightly at that and said, "I think we will find out soon." Mave then asked what he meant. Ian said that they could find out what happened here from a group of people there. A group of people were seen burying the bodies of the villagers who had been killed. Mave was then filled with anger when she saw it. Their appearance looked like they were not good people. They might also be rogues who were suspected of killing all the villagers. The captain then told his subordinates to do the job properly. He was annoyed that they took so long just to dig 6 graves. He then urged them again, but don't do it lightly. He had a nightmare last night. But the captain was then surprised when he suddenly felt the presence of someone from behind him. Mave turned out to have rushed quickly towards them on her horse. They were then surprised to see it and asked if she was a knight. The captain then told them to aim at her horse with whatever they had. He told them to aim only, and not shoot until he told them to. A true knight with a knightly soul would not show mercy on ordinary people, except for certain times. After moving closer to them, Mave then told them to drop their weapons and kowtow. But the captain did not just obey and asked her to at least tell them the reason. He had no choice if. But before he could finish Ho's sentence, he was then surprised when he saw his subordinates suddenly shoot at her. He then immediately scolded him because he had said not to shoot. The arrow shot quickly towards Mave, but the arrow was easily deflected by her. They were then shocked to see that. They had never seen someone that strong. Mave then enveloped her sword with aura, then sent a powerful attack towards the man who had shot her earlier. The attack made the man's body split into 2. The captain could only lament the man's stupidity when he saw it. He then immediately broke out in a cold sweat when Mave arrived right in front of him. They then immediately knelt down and said that this might look strange, but they didn't do anything wrong. The captain then asked her to give them time to explain. Hearing that, Mave then said that she would listen to them later. They had to explain to this man first. The captain was then confused by that, but when he saw the man's face clearly, he was then shocked because he realized that the man was Ian Hoff. When he saw Mave in front of him, the captain could only swear it was appropriate that he had a nightmare yesterday. He was then confused when he heard Mave say that the man who had just arrived would interrogate him first, and he was then shocked when he saw the man who had just arrived turned out to be Ian Hoff. Ian was then confused by his reaction. He then introduced himself to try to remind Ian. He was the hunter Miguel, the mercenary. He saw him at that time in Bulk City. After remembering again, Ian then finally remembered him. That time when he visited the first town after settling in the swamp, Bulk City. He saw Miguel in the tavern. Mave then asked if he knew him. Ian confirmed it. He had only met him once. Miguel was then happy that Ian still knew him. He said he would answer anything. He could judge whether he was telling the truth or not. Ian was then happy to see him so cooperative. He was planning to pull out his nails one by one if he pretended that they were close, but Ian admitted that he was one step ahead, and Ian then began his interrogation session. First, how did the village end up like this? Hearing that, Miguel then answered that it happened before they came to this village. Before their arrival to the village, a group of people who looked like a soldier was seen visiting the village with a torch in their hands. They then suddenly burned the houses of the residents in the village using the torch in their hands. They then confusedly asked what they were doing. How could they do something like this? Hearing that, the soldiers then said that this was an order from the landlord. It was ordered that all villagers must move to Orndale City, so the soldiers then ordered the villagers to move quickly. Hearing him mention the landlord, Mave then asked if he meant that Marquis Burchard. Philip was then shocked to hear that, and felt that it was impossible. He was confused why the landlord burned down a village that was completely fine. Hearing his confusion, Mave then said that this must be because of the war. Various places in Agellan are preparing for war. Hearing that, Ian then thought, that means this kingdom is gathering all the materials and people from important places, to prepare for the war against the neighboring country. Ian then replied, when the war started, they couldn't protect all the land. Anyway, this village would be robbed and burned later, so they just did it themselves. Even so, Philip was still confused about it. Ian just ignored his confusion. He knew the Marquis had a real reason behind it, but he didn't expect him to be prepared so soon. He then asked the next question. What did they do to the bodies, and who were they? Miguel then answered, they were the family of the village chief. They tried to resist the expulsion, so they were executed. At that time they met the villagers, and the villagers gave them some coins, and asked them to bury the bodies, so they were digging graves. Even so, Ian didn't believe it right away, and an atmosphere of silence suddenly enveloped them. Seeing that, Miguel then frantically assured him, really that's all they did. He could swear he didn't remove any part of this story. Ian was even annoyed by that. Because the quest window didn't appear, it didn't seem like a lie. Mave then asked if he believed it. Ian said yes. After getting confirmation from Ian, Mave then said she would go to the village and check if anyone was missing. Ian could only lament that HSE was really thorough when he heard that, while Miguel was still kneeling behind him while waiting for him to be allowed to leave. But Ian then suddenly said, did he say he wanted to die? Miguel was then confused to hear that, and said of course not, he just wanted to know whether they could continue their work. Hearing that, Ian then just let him. Miguel then thanked him. They had to finish quickly and leave for their initial mission. Seeing his subordinates who were just standing still, he then scolded them and told them to move quickly. Hearing that, they then quickly stood up. Seeing their behavior, Philip felt that it must be a big enough mission, because it required so many people. Miguel was then surprised when he heard him say that. He said that this was a bit awkward to say. Philip was then confused when he saw him suddenly acting like that. Ian then explained. They were bastards among the mercenaries who stole other people's missions, so he told Miguel not to explain it further, or maybe he thought he was like those scum. Miguel immediately broke out in a cold sweat when he heard that. He then quickly said no, that's not what he meant. He must have heard this rumor. There is a group of wolves who only eat humans. He said they were hiding in the forest where they came from. They had eaten quite a lot of people, and their boss's son was one of them. If not a hunter like him, who else would take it? But he was then confused when he saw their reaction after hearing his story. Ian then said that he had no intention of stealing his mission, but he then showed the werewolf's head that he had cut off and said that he had handled it. Miguel was then shocked to see that. Philip was again amazed when he saw him showing the severed head of the werewolf. Seeing that, Ian then said that he would share his rations. But Miguel was still confused. He had never heard of a werewolf among the wolves. Hearing that, Ian then said that he hid in the back and used his subordinates to do all the heavy work. Just like him, Miguel could only be silent at his implied ridicule. So about the mission, Ian then asked which village he received it from. It was already night time, and the gray color had covered the sky above. After being told about the location of the village where Miguel received his mission, Ian then invited Mave to go there, heading to a village on the way to the Red Valley. He also said that he wanted to take Miguel and the henchmen to go with them to that place. They said it would take about 2 days. They should inform the people who lost their families to wolves, and most importantly, they should restock their supplies before leaving for the Tomb Forest. After pondering for a while, Mave then agreed to it, but she felt uncomfortable. Except for Ian, she felt uncomfortable with the mercenaries. Because most of them had no god or faith, Miguel could only smile imposingly when he heard that and said that he was looking forward to working with her. After doing so all day, the process of digging their grave seemed to be almost complete. At this time of the day, Ian knew it was time for the evil beings to become active, so they must not let their guard down. He then activated mana detection. After seeing Mave, who was enveloped by a purplish aura, Ian then confirmed his guess. Mave then felt confused when Ian suddenly looked at her, and asked what was wrong. Ian said it seemed that she had not been affected by the black mage's spell. Mave was then confused and shocked to hear that, until finally she realized something. She then immediately took out the bead she exchanged from Ian. There was a very evil aura that enveloped the bead, but Mave said that she didn't see any changes. Hearing that, Ian then said that it must be because the changes were too small that she couldn't feel them. The mana waves were weak but patterned. Ian felt that this was a sign to summon evil beings, and sure enough, just as he said that, they suddenly felt an air of existence in a direction. Just said, it immediately appeared. Mave then closed her helmet again and said, "What an interesting speech." In the direction they were staring at, there was a headless horseman slowly approaching towards them. Philip finally realized the strangeness. He was shocked when he saw that the horseman did not have a head. He then asked what it was. Ian then said, it must be one of the subordinates of the black mage they were after. They might have heard it. It was a fairly well-known rumor, a headless horseman who brought chaos to the kingdom, Dullahan. Hearing that, Philip then could only lament the bad luck that befell them. They had just met a werewolf, and now there was another monster. He also confirmed Ian's words. The kingdom was now really messed up. Ian was just silent hearing that. He also didn't think the elite monsters would appear one by one like this. He could only curse the damn black mage. He really tried hard for the seeds he sowed, even though it made him not need much effort to finish it. Ian then asked Philip to give his sword. Philip was a little surprised by his sudden request, but he then immediately handed it to him. While riding back on her horse, Mave then said that she would be at the forefront. Ian didn't mind that, but he then suggested, what if they just keep an eye on it for now? Mave was then confused to hear that. Ian explained, it seemed like the Dullahan was just waiting for them to attack. He believed it was a good idea to just wait for it. He also silently thought, the response of the Dullahan is different depending on the opponent's reaction. If the player provokes, it will defend. On the contrary, if the player attacks, then it will attack. Defense is a series of dangerous patterns, but the attack is quite simple. So, the strategy to attack the Dullahan is to wait for it to attack first. Philip also felt that what Ian said was true, but they were then surprised when Miguel suddenly shouted happily behind them after finally completing their work. He was happy because he felt he could finally leave now, but he was then confused when he saw their reaction. He then asked if there was a problem. The Dullahan was then provoked after hearing the noise. It then released an aura that suppressed them. Philip, Miguel and henchmen could only grimace in pain when exposed to it. Ian was then annoyed by it, even though there was no problem before, but now thanks to him, trouble came. The Dullahan then recited an unknown language, and an energy beam then appeared in its hand. Mave was then confused by it, and asked if it was a spell. Ian denied her guess. It was just an ancient language. It talked about it could not forgive humans who dared to step foot on the land of the nymphs. Hearing that, Philip then asked if he understood their language. He was surprised by it. Ian confirmed it. It was thanks to his secret skill, ancient linguistics, which was now level 2. It was one of the skills he mistakenly chose. Judging from his strategy, it was a job skill that he raised to level 2 for the ancient civilization event, which should be resolved quickly. Although he also didn't care about the secret that the Dullahan was the ghost of the ancient lake nymph, but he was then surprised after hearing what the Dullahan said. He then immediately told them to cover their ears. Although feeling confused, but Philip then obeyed. Ian explained, it was not just an ancient language, but also a spell. If humans without hearing defenses heard it, but without having time to finish his words, he then could only swear. When he saw Miguel's henchmen acting like zombies, Miguel could only scold their stupidity. Did they not with Ian telling them to cover their ears earlier? But there was absolutely no response from the two men, and suddenly there was a movement in the grave they had been digging. A body suddenly sticking out of the ground then appeared and walked towards them. Miguel and Philip then screamed in fear when they saw it. They knew it was a ghoul. The ghouls then walked towards Miguel's henchmen who looked dazed and were about to eat them, and just as their lives were about to end, they suddenly found their clarity again. But it was too late. Miguel could only shout no when he saw it and felt sad for their fate. Philip then asked what they should do. Mave then answered she would fight him on the front lines, As she had said earlier, she told Philip to help them. Philip was then confused by the order. But Mave just ignored his confusion. She then rushed towards the Dullahan while riding her horse. The atmosphere of silence suddenly enveloped the two of them. Philip then only said that he hoped he could get rid of them before he died. Hearing that, Ian then told him not to panic just because of the ghouls. He also said there was something he had to check. He could finally see her true abilities. Mave then headed towards the Dullahan without fear, but the Dullahan certainly would not remain silent. It then sent black thorns to where Mave stood to block her way. But it was not a problem for her. Mave then enveloped her sword with aura, then slashed the thorns that blocked her way. The Dullahan didn't seem to expect that its attack would be resolved so easily, but Mave's attack didn't stop there. She then sent a strong stab right in the Dullahan's chest. When he saw her action, Ian felt that she was great. He was also a little regretful that he should have chosen the job of a knight. Mave's stab even made a hole in the Dullahan's chest. Even if he left it alone, Ian was sure that Mave would be able to defeat the Dullahan alone. But that was only if she knew their trait. When he saw Miguel and Philip so busy dealing with the ghouls, he also wondered if he should start warming up, even though its chest had a hole, but it wasn't enough to make the Dullahan die. Mave also felt that it wouldn't be easy when she saw that. She also realized that there was a strange light when they clashed. She felt that it was hiding something. But then she was shocked when she saw that the Dullahan that she had hurt so badly that it had a hole in its chest, was now back in one piece. She could only feel astonished to see that. The Dullahan then returned to reciting the ancient language and a red energy beam then reappeared in its hand. It then returned to attack Mave using the black thorn. Mave was a little overwhelmed by his sudden attack, but she was still able to finish it quite neatly. But the Dullahan's attack did not stop there. It then returned to attack Mave, who was not ready using its whip. But fortunately Mave was able to react quickly to withstand the whip attack. After looking carefully at the whip, she was surprised that the whip was made of bone, not giving Mave time to think. The Dullahan then attacked her again using its whip, but the attack could still be deflected by her. Seeing that, the Dullahan then withdrew the whip, then returned to attack Mave from the blind spot. Mave did not expect it to attack from that point. She then could only helplessly watch her hands being entangled by the whip. But it was no ordinary entanglement. Mave then felt horrified because its contaminated mana penetrated her holy power. She then could only curse. If this continues, her hands will. But she was then confused and surprised when she saw a sword slash towards the whip that wrapped her hand and freed her hand. Mave then looked in the direction the slash came from. The slash turned out to be from Ian, who had been nearby for some time. Mave could only be surprised to see that. Ian then apologized. He needed time to get rid of those behind. Now that he knew its traits, it was time to settle this. While brandishing his sword, Ian then challenged the Dullahan to fight. Once again, with all its might, he challenged it to attack him with all its strength. Seeing that, the Dullahan did not mince words and immediately attacked the two of them using its whip. The attack could still be avoided by them, but it made them scatter, and the Dullahan seemed to be more targeted towards Ian, who provoked it. Seeing that, although she did not know the details, but Mauve said she would follow his direction, she then re-enveloped her sword with aura, and said, "It would end up on the tip of this Avenger sword." Right after saying these words, Mave then focused her eyes. While Ian himself is currently being attacked by the Dullahan blindly, he also looks a little overwhelmed by the barrage of attacks. When it is close to him, the Dullahan then utters words from an ancient language. Hearing that, Ian then grinned and said, "Did you think I would lose?" He then apologized for that. Because it was the one who would lose. The Dullahan was then surprised when he saw a horse speeding towards it. Mave then came and sent a strong slash towards it. The slash even made the Dullahan's form shapeless again, but Mave even regretted it, because she saw the light again. She also wondered if she failed again. Seeing Ian rushing towards her, Mave then warned him that the Dullahan would return intact again. Hearing that, Ian then immediately replied that he knew it, and Ian then slashed, but not to the Dullahan but instead to the empty air nearby. Mave was then shocked and confused to see it, and asked questions why he attacked through the air, until finally she realized something. The shard besides the one she had slashed earlier disappeared. Without having time to recover completely, the Dullahan then returned to attack them using its body parts, although it was successfully avoided by Ian, but the attack managed to hit his horse, which made his horse spit out a mouthful of blood. Seeing that, Ian could only say to his horse that it had worked hard. He then immediately jumped off his horse and sent a slash towards the Dullahan's body fragments. Mave was surprised when she saw his slash successfully hit something. What Ian slashed then revealed itself. It turned out to be a skull head that resembled a human skull. A crack appeared on the side of the skull due to Ian's attack. Mave was then shocked to see that, and wondered if it was the Dullahan's real body. But Ian's attack did not stop there. He was then about to attack the Dullahan, who was still alive. The Dullahan then recited an ancient language and a bright red light suddenly appeared in its eyes. Mave suddenly became difficult to move when she heard that, and a bright reddish energy beam then erupted from the skull. Mave was surprised that the Dullahan was able to penetrate her holy power and make her paralyzed. She then could only curse and wonder if Ian was also affected. The Dullahan's skull then floated in front of Ian with red emanating from inside its eyes. Ian could only curse. When he saw that, he realized that the Dullahan was trying to return to its original form. He knew how serious the situation was. He had to remove the paralysis before the Dullahan could return to its original form, but as he grasped the Dullahan's skull with his hands, he then fell silent when the Dullahan suddenly said something in an ancient language. He then grinned, named monsters like Andolph, had at least one secret to escape from a critical situation, and he already guessed that the Dullahan did too. Ian's character was developed with various and even random buffs and passive skills. The many traits finally came together and created a synergized effect, and as a result, instead of paralysis, he only felt a very short slowdown when hit by the spell effect of the Dullahan. Ian then said to the Dullahan, "At times like this, being a Dreg's character is even very helpful. You also think the same, right?" The Dullahan could only feel panicked at this time. Ian then slammed the skull to the ground, with a grin on his face. He then said, "Then, now, we have to continue what we are doing, right?" And the Dullahan could only anxiously glance at him, who was now getting closer. It then immediately ran away to get away from Ian, but Ian certainly would not let it run away. He then quickly approached the Dullahan, then slashed the skull again, which made it slam back to the ground. Mave could only be silent to see it. The scene was like a bullying scene. She was also surprised by what she saw. Although the paralysis effect had been released, but what actually happened was shocking. She didn't expect the terrible monster to be destroyed unilaterally with just simple violence. A crack appeared on the skull's forehead due to Ian's sword slash. Seeing Ian, who was about to attack it again, the Dullahan then could only feel panic. It then conveyed its panic to Ian in ancient language, but Ian didn't seem to care at all. He then stabbed the skull right on its forehead in order to finish it off. A bright red energy beam suddenly erupted right when Ian did that. The energy beam made the wind blow strongly around. Mave was overwhelmed by the energy beam. Until finally the energy beam stopped. Ian then could only sigh with relief after successfully finishing off the Dullahan. Ian also said to him, "Your grudge or whatever it is, it's none of my business," and his sword then broke after successfully making the Dullahan's skull split into two. He could only regret it. One more sword was destroyed.